I knew Freddie Burgess years ago when he was an actor. He didn't work much. I won't say anything about his talent, if any, or his nondescript appearance. This last has never held anyone back. Look at Charles Aznavour. And in the latter's case, not even that voice has proved a handicap. But Freddie Burgess's big handicap was his habit of not looking anyone in the eye. He would play a two-handed scene and keep his eyes focused on the top of the other actor's head throughout. Well, now and again he might shift them to the other actor's chest via a distant corner of the set. This unnerved fellow thespians and audiences alike. It was almost as effective as staring at an actor's flies in a startled manner as soon as he's made his entrance, an old trick to throw a rival into a panic. Anyway, Freddie gave up treading the boards altogether by the time he was 30. He went into business as an agent. He did well. At first he handled bit players and novelty acts for clubs and cabarets. He phoned me a few times during this apprentice period and offered me engagements he couldn't get anyone else to accept for the money available, at the same time trying to convince me he was doing me a favour. But I must admit he's done well since. I suppose now he's got as good a list of household names on his books as any agent in the business. I put this down to the fact that agents do most of their business on the phone, and so the casting directors Freddie talks to are not distracted by his habit of never looking them in the eye. One Friday morning, not so very long ago, I was lying in bed trying to decide whether to keep the sheets on for another week or take them round to the laundrette. Since I had no other decisions to make at that time, this one loomed pretty large. So my hopes rose when the phone rang, but plummeted when I realized it was Freddie. "I hope you're not going to offer to do me a good turn," I said. "Don't be like that, Jacko. I like you. I'm always trying to help. That's what you said last time you phoned me. You offered me the equity minimum to referee women mud wrestlers. There's no point in dwelling on the might have been. I'm phoning to talk about the here and now." "Go on then," I said. I didn't have to feign indifference. I was indifferent. "I've got a sweet little cottage in the Cotswolds just for weekends. Get away from it all sort of place. Relax, recharge the old batteries and so on. Would you like to come down for a couple of days? Do you good. Change of air, change of scene. Do come." I must admit I had been finding the flatlet a bit oppressive that winter, and so the idea appealed to me. It was just a pity that it came from Freddie Burgess. On the other hand, there seemed no point in going on waiting for the Olivias to invite me to Brighton. But I knew Freddie of old. "What's the catch?" I said. "Oh, Jacko, you're such an old cynic. There is no catch." "But I was telling my girlfriend about you, and she said, 'Why don't you invite him down to the cottage for a weekend? He sounds a bundle of fun. You'd love Katrina.'" "I'm sure. When did you and Katrina have in mind?" "What's wrong with this weekend? No time like the present. Bit cold for the country, isn't it? Not at Woodbine Cottage. Wonderful log fire roaring away and walls 2 feet thick. We could pick you up and drive down tonight in time for a good dinner. Katrina's a wonderful cook." Well, I accepted. But Freddie's description aroused expectations which were never fulfilled. True, it was a pretty little cottage, just as he described. There was nothing at all wrong with the outside of it, thatch and twinkling lights in the windows. Freddie's local Mrs. Mop had switched them on all ready for us. Unfortunately, she had failed to ignite the logs she'd laid over newspapers in the fireplace. The place was like an igloo. Well, after Freddie had been on his knees blowing and fanning with newspapers for 20 minutes, clouds of smoke billowed out into the room, and there was barely a glimmer of flame. We all started coughing, and I detected a distinct tickling at the back of my throat. I went up to the bathroom for a gargle. I cursed the English countryside, the month of March, and Freddie Burgess one after the other. I took a swig from the quarter bottle of proprietary whisky I always keep in reserve. I just about made up my mind to go down and insist that Freddie drive me to Oxford to catch a bus to London when I heard a car draw up outside. There was a lot of shouting as someone was greeted enthusiastically. Freddie shouted up to me to hurry down. He had a surprise for me, he said. The surprise was a big one. It was Grace Weaver. You won't recognize the name because I've changed it, but the woman I have rechristened Grace Weaver was one of the biggest TV stars of the period. She played the lead in a popular soap opera set in a dormitory town, trendies mixed with old people rehoused from city slums. Grace played a sort of Lady Bountiful who lived alone apart from her invalid father, who was bedridden. She cared for him and for everyone else who needed help, including cats and dogs. She was regarded as a wonderful woman. I rarely watch these long-running serials myself, but I had seen enough publicity in the press to know that Grace Weaver was the sheet anchor and star. And here, in the flesh, she immediately took her place as the star of Woodbine Cottage. Freddie danced attendance, while Katrina got to work in the kitchen. After we'd been introduced, Grace went over to the window and pulled the curtain aside. She peered into the darkness from right to left. "I seem to have given them the slip," she said. "No sign of them so far." "Fans must be a problem even in a little village like this," I said, just to show that I knew what she was talking about. All I actually showed was that I didn't know. "I'm talking about the press," she said with a hint of exasperation. "Thank goodness I gave them the slip when I left home, and they don't know I'm here." Then she treated me to a broad professional smile. "It's very nice of you to come down. I appreciate it." She spoke as though I was doing her a personal favour. The remark seemed odd, but it was the last of its kind. In fact, it was the last remark she made about anyone other than herself. "What did you think of Tuesdays?" she said. I was a bit slow to react. I was about to say, "Tuesdays what?" when I realized she was referring to her show. The pause didn't throw her for a second. She started to pour out a stream of worries and concerns about the top-rated serial. "You must have noticed the tea I poured for old Lizzie. It looked like plain hot water. The prop man swore he'd used 2 tea bags, but I actually took the lid off the pot when I knew I was out of shot, and I could see there was only one. I asked Jeff to shoot the scene again, but he said poor old Lizzie was too tired." Tired? She'd been up half the night opening a disco at Wolverhampton. I make it a rule to go to bed at 9 when I have an early call. And did you notice Vandra? Those bags under her eyes? Well, she wasn't actually working in Blackpool, and that's what some people might call it. Anyway, that's her personal life, and it's her own affair. But she was positively lethargic and didn't know a damn line. "What did you think of my new hairstyle?" "Loved it," said Freddie. "You looked marvellous." She looked at me. I was taken off guard. I hadn't seen the show for years, of course. I decided to pretend I was a devoted fan who just happened, unfortunately, not to have been able to watch last Tuesday. "You could have recorded it," she said. "I'm such a duffer with the old VTR," I said. "Never seem to get it right." Having spent an hour in the kitchen, Katrina brought in some warmed-up pizzas and wet salad, and Freddie opened a wine box of rosé. We followed these with individual fruit tarts and processed cheese, instant coffee. Not exactly the country fare one might expect in the heart of rural England. Through it all, Grace kept up her monologue. Freddie made a good effort at appearing interested, his eyes focusing on Grace's forehead, her elbows, and her navel, the latter concealed, of course, by a ranch mink coat, which screamed overseas repeats. After a couple of hours, just as Grace was about to launch into a blow-by-blow account of how she got a scriptwriter sacked because of grammatical errors which had provoked a Cambridge Don into writing her a fan letter, I got up and said I really must have an early night. Freddie protested. So did Katrina. But not Grace. She merely shifted her posture so that she could concentrate on the audience of 2 which remained. I put my pyjamas on over my thermal underwear and added my cardigan for extra protection and jumped into the ice-cold sheets. I threw my overcoat over the bed and took a swig of whiskey. Even so, I couldn't get to sleep. A couple of hours later, I heard the others come upstairs. Believe it or not, Grace had got back to the problem of the tea looking weak in last Tuesday's ep. After a very poor night, I was woken by someone thumping down the stairs. Perhaps Freddie is going to bring us all breakfast in bed, I thought, obviously quite out of touch with reality. It turned out he was on the phone, and when he came back upstairs, he knocked and went into Grace's room. I heard her start talking as soon as he opened the door, something about the storyline being changed and old Lizzie being written out in the next few eps. Then I heard Katrina going downstairs. I decided to follow and perhaps encourage her to be a bit more enterprising in the culinary department. She was sitting in the kitchen warming herself at the gas cooker. She had the oven full on with the door open. It was the warmest place in the house, and she moved up to make room for me. "The kettle's on," she said. "I'm going to make some coffee." "Good," I said. "Any chance of some toast?" "No bread, only slim bisques." "Got your speech ready?" she said. I thought I must have misheard her and asked her to repeat it. "For the journalist." "Speech?" I said. "Well, statement." "What statement?" "To the press, of course. He'll be here quite soon." "Who will be here?" "The newspaper man. Aren't you awake yet? I don't have anything to make a statement about." She covered her open mouth with her hand, and then she took it away and said, "Do you really mean Freddie hasn't told you?" "Told me what?" "That you and Grace are supposed to be having an affair." My first impulse was to rush upstairs and confront Freddie, demand an explanation. Then I realized I'd probably get a more honest version from Katrina. I was right. She took a sip of the instant and went on. "Don't you ever read the papers? She's supposed to be having an affair with Gregory Reichardt. Don't tell me you don't know who he is." "I don't." "You're a funny one, you are. Gregory plays the vicar in the show, and he's left his wife. The papers have been full of it. It's very bad for her image. Stands to reason, doesn't it? She's supposed to be the do-gooder of all time, and he's the flaming vicar, and they're at it like knives, the pair of them. So it's just a question of whether the company does a rewrite job and drops them or cancels the show altogether. But it's a big earner for them. On the other hand, when the franchises are carved up..." "I understand that," I said, "but where do I come in?" "Well, Freddie got the idea of Grace starting something with a single man. You're single, aren't you?" "Yes." "That's what Freddie said. There aren't many around of a suitable age. Grace was divorced years ago, so if the press can get hold of another story and keep it going, the company would have time to replace the vicar. Gregory isn't a client, so Freddie doesn't care what happens to him." "Freddie doesn't care what happens to me either." "That's Freddie. But I'm surprised he never told you. He could have done it all right over the phone. I wouldn't have agreed. Perhaps he knew that, and that's why he didn't tell you." "I'm sure it is. Anyway, too late now." I stood up. "Where are you going?" "I'm going to tell him what I think of him." "Using me like this, it's despicable." "Don't go up yet, not until I've got away." "Are you leaving?" "Yes, I've had Freddie Burgess up to here. It's the first time I've ever stayed the night with him, and it's the last." "Incompatible?" "That's the word for it. He made love to me without looking, kept staring at the wash basin and the knob on the flipping door. Gave me the creeps. And you know what he said when I mentioned it? What? Turn the light off. It's a mannerism. He can't help it." "Well, I'm not having any more of it. There's my taxi." She picked up her overnight case and put on her fun fur. "I'm going to Oxford and getting a bus to London." "Tell him..." She paused. "Tell him what?" "Nothing. I reckon you'll have enough to tell him the way he's dropped you in it with the press. Cheerio, Jacko. See you sometime." She kissed me on the cheek and was gone. I waited for the taxi to drive away, and then I went to the foot of the stairs. Grace was still raving on. I went up and banged on her door. "Freddie, I want a word with you." There was a moment's pause, and I heard Grace go on as if nothing had happened. I felt really angry. I banged again. I heard Freddie come to the door. "Just a minute, Jacko. Grace is telling me about the poor camera work on the exteriors." "Never mind that. Come out. I want a word with you." "Later." "No, now. Hurry up." He opened the door. "Look, Jacko, can't you go and have a bit of breakfast with Katrina?" "Katrina's gone. She's walked out on you. Fed up with you never looking at her properly." I almost felt sorry for him. He stared up at the ceiling. "Gone?" he said. Grace called over from the bed. "What is it, Freddie? I want to tell you about the stray dog I was supposed to feed the week before last. They drugged the damn thing to keep it quiet, and I've had letters from people who thought it was dead." "Just a second, Grace, darling. Katrina's done a bunk." "Who's Katrina?" "My girlfriend. You had dinner with her last night." "Oh, yes. Reminded me of the therapist who treated Dad in episode 902. I have to talk to Jacko. You remember Jacko?" Before she had a chance to say anything, I pulled Freddie towards me and closed the bedroom door. "You set me up, Freddie," I said. "You lured me into a trap. I'm off. I'm phoning for a taxi, and I'm getting the bus from Oxford. No, Jacko, you can't let me down now. The columnist will be here any minute. If you'll just feed him a story about you and Grace's romance..." "You mean something in the bricks without straw category?" "You can make up some rubbish, Jacko. You've written film scripts." "Thanks. No, Freddie, I'm leaving." Freddie whimpered. "Jacko, please, I'll pay you cash." There was a pause, followed by the inevitable question from me, How much? Don't tie me down. I'll see you receive a token of my appreciation. I don't want a token. Just then a large car drew up outside. Freddie grasped my hand. That'll be him now, he whimpered. I knew I had all the cards. 200, I said, in notes. 200? I'm not a rich man. There was loud knocking at the front door. 200 or I'm off. Jacko. The knocking was repeated, louder this time. I didn't say any more. Freddie looked up at the ceiling and nodded. All right, you've got me over a barrel. He went into Grace's room and I went downstairs. It was a long time since I'd done anything that required me to use my creative talent, and I looked forward to exercising it. I opened the front door. A tall man, handsome but a bit gone to seed, walked straight past me and into the living room. I've known ill-mannered newspaper men all my life, but I was taken off guard by this display from a columnist who was there by arrangement. I was about to protest, but I didn't get a chance. He threw his hat and coat on a chair and spoke to me. Where is she? Still in bed, I replied, with a doggish leer. He didn't notice the latter and moved towards the stairs. She doesn't want to be disturbed, I said, stepping in front of him. But I'm prepared to talk. Who are you? J. Kingston Platt. No hyphen. So, where's Freddie? He's in bed too, doesn't want to be disturbed. And you're J. Kingston what? Platt. Stage, films, TV, you name it. Oh, I get it, you're one of Freddie's clients. No? Then what are you doing here? Obvious, isn't it? I'm here because Grace is here. He didn't say anything, he just stood there looking at me. I wondered why he seemed so thick. I knew that gossip writers were not always well endowed with the old grey matter. If they were, they'd actually be famous personalities instead of parasites. I tried to help him by spelling it out. It's too early to tell you about wedding arrangements, but you can take it from me that we have discussed marriage. Marriage? You and Grace? That's right, we both favour a church wedding or possibly a cathedral. You're out of your mind. I beg your pardon? Just when did you discuss marriage with Grace Weaver? Lying in bed this morning. You know how it is. You both feel euphoric and church bells are ringing in the distance. Well, this fellow suddenly grabs me by the throat. I can't recall when I've had such a shock, and the expression on his face was really terrifying. I remember thinking that if the old horror crowd at Hammer Films had seen it, they would have signed him up there and then. You rat, he hissed at me. You stinking little rat. Now, wait a minute, I said, using up valuable breath. His reply was to release me and push me into a deep armchair. My instinct told me to stay there. I watched him take off his jacket and roll up his shirt sleeves. He had arms like telegraph poles. He spat on his palms. The signs were unmistakable. He intended roughing me up. What paper are you working for? I asked, ignoring his preparations. Shut up, he snarled. Nobody makes a monkey out of Gregory Reichardt and gets away with it. Mr. Reichardt, I said. Why, I had no idea. It's all a mistake. I thought you were a newspaper man. I don't care what you thought. I could see his right fist drawing back to make a swing. I had encountered sexual jealousy before, but never in so physical a form. I was terrified, and the best I could come up with was, I wouldn't touch Grace Weaver with a barge pole. Fortunately, the shock value of this ungentlemanly remark outweighed its offensiveness. Gregory Reichardt aborted his right swing. It was Freddie's idea, part of a diversionary exercise to deflect attention from you. So that's why that Fleet Street chap phoned me this morning. I didn't know what he was talking about. Asked me about her new beau. I thought it was something to do with how she was doing her hair. You said you wouldn't touch her with a barge pole. It was a figure of speech. It was insulting to the woman I love. I wanted to convince you very quickly that I don't find her attractive. You don't? He seemed surprised. Why not? Well, I said, the creative juices beginning to flow at last. Beautiful and truly magnetic though she is, I don't feel I could ever share her interests and aspirations. I'm much too egotistical, for one thing, so engrossed in my own career. I haven't seen an episode of her show for over 7 years. Been abroad, have you? No, interested in other things. It's top of the rating. 20 million people watch us every week. That reminds me. He went to the foot of the stairs and called up, "Grace, darling, it's me. Come down, it's shampoo's time." With that he put on his jacket and hurried out to his car. Grace hurried downstairs, followed by Freddie. Grace was overexcited. Freddie was frightened. "Where is he?" They spoke with one voice. I pointed to the open door, getting something from the car. Gregory came back. He was carrying a magnum of Bollinger 73. He and Grace embraced like a couple of love-struck kids. Freddie got more and more upset. "You've blown it, you know that, Greg? I've been trying to put the press off the scent by using a red herring." "Me," I interjected. "But if they find out you're here with Grace," Freddie was walking round the entwined couple without getting the attention of either of them, "then you'll both be all over the front pages tomorrow." Gregory released Grace and held up his hand. "I know how you feel, Freddie, but everything has changed. I have news for you. Got any glasses?" I was pleased to see him start to take the wire off the champagne. Freddie looked at me. "Jacko, would you mind?" I went into the kitchen and brought in 4 glasses. Greg had opened the bottle. I held out the tray. He looked at it. "4?" he said. "I'm a guest," I said, stoutly. "Who is this bloody geezer?" inquired television's most popular vicar. "Someone Freddie is trying to get into the show?" "No," said Freddie, "just a friend. He is doing, or was doing, me a good turn." "Unwittingly," I murmured. Greg poured the drinks, hesitating for a split second before the 4th glass. "What are we celebrating?" said Grace. "Us," said Greg, and Freddie winced. "The company has had a change of heart. They had a firm do some in-depth research. Grace and I are easily the most popular characters." "Always have been," said Grace. "They did a survey in 76, and all the polls since have shown the same." "I know," said Gregory, "but this one showed that viewers would not be shocked if you and I got together once your father has passed on." "Marvellous," she replied. "Then he'll have to go." Gregory smiled. "He's as good as gone. I've spoken to the writer this morning. He will have a relapse next week, hang on for 3 eps, and then bingo, we'll pass on watching a test match on TV. I shall be around a lot more to help you through the crisis, and then, as soon as the funeral's over, wedding bells." "Is this official?" said Freddie. "Absolutely. I spoke to Des this morning." "What a turn-up," said Freddie, and helped Greg and Grace to more champagne, then filled his own glass. I filled my own. They all noticed. I didn't care. "Tough on the actor," I remarked. "Actor?" said Freddie. "The actor playing the father. He's had 11 years of it, never out of bed. He's made enough money to buy a golf course in Portugal. We don't have to worry about him." Grace wasn't worried, of course. "It's going to be the wedding of the year," she said. "We'll get the people who design the royals' wedding dresses to do mine. Not white pastel. It could be the 2000th ep. That would be sensational." It was at this point that another car arrived outside. It was the gossip columnist who'd been expected. Unfortunately for me, I was obviously no longer required to be the red herring set up by Freddie, so I was 200 quid worse off, and my throat was beginning to tickle again. I decided to cut my losses. Do you believe me when I say I was able to make a phone call to the taxi service, go up and pack my bags and take them out without any one of those 3 even noticing? It was as if I was invisible and inaudible. They were rabbiting on about the coming wedding and ep this and ep that, Freddie being very proprietorial and looking all over the place. I met Katrina waiting for the bus. We had a pleasant journey back to town. Later that year, she persuaded me to accompany her on a tour of Europe with the modern dance company she belonged to. Some other week I must tell you about it. Late 1949 found me standing poleaxed in a corridor at Boreham Wood Studios. I'd just had an unsuccessful interview for the part of a corpse in a low-budget thriller. I was so disappointed and angry that I think if I'd had a gun I would have shot myself there and then, just to prove my suitability to the director who'd rejected me. Fortunately, my survival mechanism soon started working again, and I went along to the canteen and treated myself to the set lunch. Well, treated is hardly the right word. It was curried cat food served on a bed of unsweetened rice pudding. I was trying to choke this vile combination down when a cheerful young man in RAF uniform asked me if he might join me. He said we'd met during the war when I was touring Air Force bases with a show called Chins Up. He explained that he was wearing his old uniform because he was official advisor on a film called Dinghy, with an exclamation mark, and was feeling depressed because the producers were ignoring his advice. I explained that advisors were employed not to make sure everything was authentic, but so that producers could take what liberties they liked and have an expert to blame if there was criticism later. Clive was so interested in my professional activities that I felt obliged to make an effort. He listened with childlike concentration to my fictional account of deals and offers and plans, and this helped to take my mind off the set lunch curry, which, impatient with the normal channels, was fighting to get out through the walls of my stomach. Clive was sometime getting to the point. He began by telling me that he wanted to get started as a film producer. He'd inherited his father-in-law's ornamental brass business, so he wasn't short of a few bob. But he wasn't mad enough to try and finance a picture with all his own money. For a ghastly moment I thought he was going to ask me to help with financial backing myself, which would have entailed disappointing both of us. He leaned over and whispered in my ear, "It's a blue movie." He got it out at last, and then went on quickly to prevent me raising an objection. A Dutch business contact of mine in ornamental brassware has an interest in offbeat clubs on the continent. Snag is, he doesn't have the facilities for this type of subject, but since there's a big demand, he wants to jump on the bandwagon, and I'm pretty sure that if I can come up with what he wants, then he'll go along with me later and back me in something above board. Processing he can cope with himself, so if we can shoot the footage here and get it over to him, our troubles are over. I noted the introduction of the we and adopted it myself. But how do we get it over to him? I was thinking of the English and Dutch customs officers, who were very puritanical at the time. I've worked all that out. I've got an old Humber shooting brake, and my idea is to take my wife Sally and the kids over to Holland with the cans of undeveloped film hidden underneath a lot of camping gear and toys in the back. With Sally and 6 kids, no customs man in the world is going to suspect we've got anything we shouldn't have. If you'll find some time to organise a unit, a skeleton crew and a cast, and take charge during the day's shooting, I'll split with you 50-50. I looked inscrutable. The Dutchman is going to pay $3,000 on delivery, in pounds, so if we can make the picture for $2,000, then we get $500 apiece. This was big money in those far-off days, but of course I pulled a face. I've got a script here. It's called The Eager Bride, and he produced a foolscap envelope from his briefcase. It's a bit sketchy as it stands, but we should naturally do quite a bit of work on it on the floor. Improvisation. Exactly. What do you say? I'm in. Provided I get my out-of-pocket expenses. Done. We shook hands. I have an idea for a studio, I said, after I'd looked at the crude little script. It's a small place used for commercial stills, but it might just be big enough. The owner's a friend of mine, so I must find a way of hiring it without telling him what we want it for. Otherwise, naturally, he'll screw us for the rental. But I'll find a way round that. Now, I have a number of important engagements this afternoon. I lied smoothly. But I'll go round to the studio and see if my friend is there. Also, look at the premises to make sure they're suitable. I have a pretty tight schedule this evening, too, but I'll try to get home early and work out a rough budget. I'll phone you around midnight. Good man, said Clive, and gave me his number. The stills man was out when I got to the studio, which turned out to be lucky because I was able to have a chat with his receptionist and got some useful information. Jan, she told me, stressing his first name in such a way as to leave me in no doubt as to what their true relationship was, Jan is on vacation, but will be around for the rest of the week, except possibly Friday afternoon. We always go to the cottage at the weekend, and sometimes we get away early. Saturday would suit me perfectly, I said. It's only a little test commercial for Ovaltine. All I need to shoot is a man's hand, a woman's hand, and a steaming hot mug." She said she thought Jan would be agreeable, and I asked if I could take a look at the place again, just to refresh my memory. When I saw it, I was delighted. There was a large divan, ideal for what we wanted, and several other props which would help to dress the set. The ceiling was a bit low for overhead shots, but I judged that if we kept the bed low on the ground and used clever lighting, it could be coped with, given the cooperative cast. Which brought me to the next problem. Nowadays there are plenty of experienced performers doing this sort of work, and any number are willing to give it a go. But in the 50s these people were thin on the ground. However, by reviving acquaintanceships with people I'd dropped long ago, I was able to contact most of the members of the Blue Film Colony in this country. This was, as I say, before pornography had become a growth industry. I had a number of very depressing interviews before I got hold of the name and address of a woman in Wembley Park, Mrs. Gloria Edgecliffe. I went to see her and her husband at their tasteful little flat. She was an attractive 28 or 30 and looked neat and trim in a gingham housecoat, her hair tied up in a turban-style scarf. She showed me into the lounge and closed the doors leading to the dinette. "My little boy is in there doing his homework," she explained in a high-pitched squeak. I told myself the voice didn't matter because we were shooting mute and leaving the Dutchman to get the film dubbed. She introduced me to her husband and we shook hands. He then pulled the blinds, though it was still light outside. "Nosy Parkers round here." He gave his wife a nudge. She took this as her cue and immediately slipped off her housecoat and the underwear underneath. She was so quick it seemed like a conjuring trick. She turned round a couple of times to allow me to have a good view of her stock in trade, and then offered me a piece of homemade fudge from a box on the mantelpiece. "Beautiful, isn't she?" said the husband. With that he lifted her top lip with his finger and thumb. "Look at those teeth, all beautifully kept by a Viennese dentist in Harley Street, the same man who repaired a bridge for Richard Tauber. Her teeth are perfect now and will photograph perfect. I defy you to find a blemish." I hummed approval. "All right, dear," he said, as she helped herself to another piece of fudge. "Relax a moment while I talk to the gentleman." She slipped on a cardigan and sat down with some knitting. "I wish I could have seen your wife work. It would help me to decide." "Let her strip for you," he said eagerly. I said I thought she already had. No, we just wanted you to see her body, but she does a great strip. Gloria, go and slip on your little oyster silk brocade and give the gentleman a run-through." She laid her knitting aside and disappeared into the bedroom. He went to the radiogram and put on a record. "I won't put it full on because of Derek," he said, pointing to the double doors. "Homework," he reminded me. The strip of music began and the bedroom door opened. Mrs. Edgecliffe sashayed into the room wearing a shapely white frock, which I made a mental note to ask her to wear for the eager bride. She still wore the turban scarf. She stood on the hearthrug, undulating from head to foot. Mr. Edgecliffe was kneeling down a few feet in front of her, with his hands held in front of his face like a great conductor leading his orchestra through a quiet passage. He spoke in a near whisper. "All right, dear, start to peel." Mrs. Edgecliffe changed gear and gyrated her pelvis and threw back her head so that the turban was tossed aside and her hair came cascading down her back. Slowly her hands caressed their way round her waist to her rear. "Easy does it," murmured Mr. Edgecliffe. "Take all the time in the world. That's it. Gently does it." The dress slipped down over her thighs with tantalizing slowness. She kicked it aside, and Mr. Edgecliffe picked it up and arranged it over the hanger he'd been holding in readiness. After caressing her thighs in a way that I was afraid might make a partner seem redundant, she undid the buttons on the suspender belt which supported her sheer stockings. She tossed the belt aside and flashed a wink at her imaginary groom. Peeling off the stockings took ages, and all the time Mr. Edgecliffe was whispering words of encouragement. She raised her arms above her head and leaned backwards. When she was horizontal, she gave several frenzied twists of her pelvis and stomach muscles preparatory to removing her lacy panties, which I noticed were beautifully embroidered with the letters G.E. All her own work, murmured Mr. Edgecliffe proudly. She's a genius with her needle. Once this frilly example of her craft had reached her feet, she used her big toe as a fulcrum and spun it round 3 times and flicked it across the room in a huge arc. The alert Mr. Edgecliffe caught it with both hands in a style not out of place at Lord's. She jumped off the bed, and holding hands and laughing, they both bowed. After a tedious half-hour's bargaining, we settled on a fee to cover both Mrs. Edgecliffe and her husband. He insisted on being present for all shooting. It was a great load off my mind to get my female star signed up, as I knew that the 2 smaller parts wouldn't cause any trouble, and I'd now be free to concentrate on my search for the pivotal role of the sexy waiter. I shook hands, and Gloria, having slipped on her housecoat again, called her son Derek. He came out of the dinette and showed us the rainfall map of Britain, which he'd been working on during his mother's demonstration. I said I hoped we hadn't disturbed him. He didn't speak in reply, merely winked. I shall never understand children. I hurried back to the West End to see a Jamaican limbo dancer whom I'd arranged to meet in the dingy club at which he was appearing. At 2 p.m. it was even dingier than normal, and the limbo dancer proved to have a female partner from whom he refused to be separated, even for the duration of the interview. He told me they'd be pleased to do anything that a man and a woman can do together, and I swear to you that they were prepared to give me an audition there and then. When I revealed that we already had a leading lady, the female partner gave her boyfriend a vicious slap on the face, and they started screaming at each other. So, while they were distracted, I slipped out of the fire exit and past the overflowing waste bins. I was still in the dark alley when I heard footsteps behind me and someone hissing to catch my attention. It was a well-built black man in a barman's jacket. "Excuse me," he said in a public school accent, "but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation in the club. I'm the barman, by the way, Geoffrey." He held out his hand, and I shook it very warmly indeed to show how unprejudiced I was. "I wondered whether I might be able to oblige," he asked with a knowing wink. I must have looked interested, because he went on, "I loathe people who boast of their sexual prowess, but I've been fairly active in that area, and, well, let's say I've had a few complaints. Do you think you might consider me?" I asked him if he had any acting experience. "Only at university, but I've done a bit of extra work in rather trashy films." I was quite impressed. I told him I'd have a word with my co-producer and let him know something soon. I didn't need to make any decision then, because I knew that at least I had a possible sexy waiter and a definite first-class bride. Casting the inadequate husband and the pert chambermaid was merely a matter of a phone call. Having done that, I was free to concentrate on the more difficult task of engaging a crew. I had already mulled this problem over in my mind and decided to approach a rather elderly cameraman, Fred Mundy, who lived nearby. Apart from his age, Fred had 2 disadvantages. He was deaf, and he smoked an evil-smelling pipe. Although it was never out of his mouth, he'd not mastered the art of keeping it alight, nor had he mastered the art of using his lighter efficiently. So, what with his deaf aid, his pipe, and his lighter, he was, most of the time, too busy with his hands to be able to do much else. Nevertheless, he knew about lighting sets, and he would have one big advantage as an employee: he would be grateful. I arranged to meet him at the Goat and Compasses, and when I arrived he was relighting his pipe with such concentration that I didn't dare interrupt him to announce myself. He was puffing and blowing and pressing the tobacco down with his left forefinger, and with his right hand he was flipping the wheel of a lighter, which was already burning like something in a torchlight procession. Eventually the lighter got too hot for him, and it clattered to the floor. An alert barmaid squirted soda water on it as it burned away on the lino. Fred rebuked her for interfering, and if he hadn't suddenly become aware of me standing there, I think there might have been a heated argument. Excuse the pun. Heated. He shook hands and switched on his deaf aid. A sound came out of it like a public address system being switched on. "What can I do for you, young man?" he asked. I opened my mouth, and it struck me quite suddenly that I couldn't tell him what I was there to tell him without about 15 complete strangers in the bar overhearing me. I tried to think what to do. Fred thought his deaf aid had gone wrong, and he gave it a thump. He looked at me. "If you speak without moving your lips, how can I lip read?" he said. I leaned over to speak quietly into his appliance, and he emitted 2 lungfuls of noxious fumes. I pulled back, coughing. He naturally didn't understand what my problem was, and was getting impatient. Since the other people in the bar had stopped talking to each other and were looking at us, I decided to offer Fred the job without telling him the type of film we were making. To keep his interest, I fell back on the story of the Ovaltine commercial. He was obviously delighted at the prospect of working again, and he bought several rounds of drinks for strangers by way of celebration. He was very merry indeed by closing time, and as I walked him home, he was too drunk for me to explain the true nature of the job he'd been engaged for. Nevertheless, we shook hands on our bargain, and I left him on his doorstep, his lighter held to his ear and trying to light his pipe with his deaf aid. Next day, Clive and I spent a couple of hours with Geoffrey. It was a difficult job deciding whether he'd be able to play this sexy waiter or not, on account of his inexperience. Fortunately, he was able to show us some informal snapshots of himself taken with a wide spectrum of girlfriends. They were not obscene pictures by any means, but they did provide ample evidence that Geoffrey was equipped by nature for the role, and also that he was a man who was in no sense furtive about his sexual needs. We decided to take a chance with him and fixed a mutually acceptable fee that was a good deal less than we'd expected to pay. Another week of preparations brought us to the eve of the big day. I saw Jan, the photographer, off to the cottage with his indiscreet receptionist on the Friday night, and Clive gave me a hand moving our stuff in. I ran through the schedule with Clive, and he said it was all just super. Then he told me about his own arrangements. Sally was going to drive the kids up from the country in the Humber shooting break and pick up the 2 of us about 6 in the evening. I pointed out that it was going to be a bit crowded with 6 kids and 3 adults, but Clive said it wasn't a long journey to Dover, and when he docked at Amsterdam, a full load would deter customs from scrutinising us. I took his word for it. Since this meant we would be collecting the cash from the Dutchman within hours of completing the film, I raised no objection. We both felt optimistic, even smug, when we parted that night to go to our respective beds. Next morning, after a good old-fashioned breakfast, I got a taxi and picked up the camera, etc., and was at the studio by 7:15. Clive arrived a few minutes later, and together we got the gas ring going and found some coffee cups. Mr. and Mrs. Edgecliffe were the first to arrive, and after grabbing a coffee each, they made a beeline for the bed. "Make sure it's right for you, dear," he said. She slipped off her shoes and stood on it. Then she jumped up and down, knelt, rolled, gyrated, bumped, and finally lay down flat. "It's a teeny-weeny bit soft." Mr. Edgecliffe explained that Gloria liked to work on a firm surface. We'd just put a piece of hardboard under the mattress when Geoffrey arrived, and we were soon busy with introductions. A moment later, we were joined by Neville, the prop man, still spry at 73, and Fred Mundy and his assistant, a shifty-eyed youth who was dressed more expensively than anyone else there. The make-up girl, Doris, who I happened to know was an expelled bunny, arrived late and out of breath, and just as I was beginning to think they may not turn up at all, we discovered the 2 small parts sitting in the minuscule dressing-room at the back. I clapped my hands and shouted that we must all get down to work. This was a signal for Fred to shake his head at the lights. Then he shook his head at the camera. Then he looked round the studio and shook his head yet again. This last gesture of despair seemed to take in every aspect of our enterprise, and I became quite apprehensive because I knew Fred was anticipating photographing a modest commercial for Ovaltine, and had no idea yet that he was about to start making his first blue movie. I drew him aside and explained that I hadn't been able to speak freely at the Goat and Compasses, and hadn't had a chance to phone him and explain exactly the type of picture I envisaged. While I was talking, he picked up a copy of the flimsy script and was thumbing through it. Suddenly he looked at me, his eyes bulging. "It's blue," he said. "It's a blue movie." He was getting overexcited, and I was afraid he might not last the distance. "Why didn't you tell me, eh? What did you mean about Ovaltine?" He banged his deaf aid as though he believed I was giving explanations that were inaudible to him. I tried to divert his attention by introducing him to Clive, the speed of whose response was worthy of his fighter pilot days. He shook Fred by the hand and shouted that he had always wanted to work with him ever since he'd seen Fred's award-winning work in Forgotten Waterways of Britain, a picture he made 20 years before. Clive said that The Eager Bride was quite unworthy of such a magnificent artist, but that it was merely a sprat to catch a mackerel. He had several epics in the pipeline. Unfortunately, Mr. Edgecliffe overheard this remark and took exception to the word sprat. "Gloria Edgecliffe does not perform in sprats," he shouted. I soothed him by saying that our future plans with Fred Mundy would also include Gloria, if we could possibly afford her, and I promised her solo star billing, script approval, and in fact the lot. What, I thought, do I have to lose? Meanwhile, Fred had made the appropriate compromises with his integrity and was sipping a cup of instant. I called for the cast, and we went over the first scene. The action called for the maid to open the bedroom door, show in the bride and groom, turn round, and see the sexy waiter passing with a tray. She then had to whisper in his ear and point towards the closed door. He had to stoop and look through the keyhole. Dissolve. This was where we planned to have the 3-minute stripping scene from the point of view of the keyhole. There followed another short scene outside the bedroom door in which the husband had to walk out in a huff and the waiter had to walk in looking sexy. We decided to shoot this last out of sequence to save setting up twice. Also, these little corridor scenes were simple and would serve to break the ice. They should have been no trouble at all. Unfortunately, Fred was having problems with the camera. It was a Brunner Mark 9 and in good condition, but Fred kept banging the side bit, much as he banged his deaf aid. He seemed to have no other remedy for things mechanical. While he was fussing, Don, his immaculate assistant, was arranging the lights and seizing every chance to chat up the pert chambermaid. We rehearsed the simple actions required, and Fred said that his camera was now working satisfactorily, though he still seemed to be having trouble with both deaf aid and lighter. I told myself that 1 out of 3 was better than nothing. The makeup girl patted the artist's noses and arranged a wisp of Gloria's hair. Fred checked a light, looked over to me, and nodded. "Quiet, please," I shouted. "Action!" At last, I thought, we are on our way. I could hardly have been more wrong. How can I explain? From that moment when I shouted action, it was as if the Creator up there in the great control room in the sky had gathered all his acolytes, angels, call them what you will, assistants, and had pointed with his Michelangelo forefinger down at number 22B Soho Lane and said to them, "For the rest of today I want you all to drop whatever else you're doing and concentrate on making life unbearable for the director of the blue movie The Eager Bride. His name is J. Kingston Platt, and I don't want any excuses from any of you. Give him hell." At this time next week, I hope to describe how enthusiastically they sprang to execute his wish. Last week, regular listeners will remember, I had just shouted the word action as the camera rolled on the very first scene of The Eager Bride. The 2 supporting actors, the inadequate husband and the pert chambermaid, had rehearsed their short and undemanding roles quite well, but the word action had on them the opposite effect that the smell of gunpowder is said to have on cavalry horses. They both became unsure of themselves and tongue-tied. The inadequate husband tripped as he entered the room, and the pert chambermaid closed the door with such nervous energy that the knob came off in her hand. It was a close shot, and we should not have seen the doorknob had she not held it up like a conjurer producing an egg out of thin air. We put it back. I took her aside and explained that there was nothing to worry about. I should have remembered that this always has the opposite effect to that which is intended, and it did in this case. Her face went a deep beetroot colour, and she was in no way pert. The mishaps increased rapidly in tempo and scale. The chambermaid's friend and protector arrived, and despite the fact that he was carrying on a torrid affair with her nightly in his mirror-lined flat overlooking Regent's Park, he was aggrieved at the possibility of any of his brother barristers going to a blue movie and recognizing the pert chambermaid as his mistress. After a few words, the irate QC picked her up and carried her bodily out into the street where his Aston Martin was throbbing at the curbside. He chucked her into the passenger seat on top of his bowler hat, got in the other side, and drove away dangerously. It was upsetting, and would have been a lot worse had I not realized that by leaving without permission she had forfeited her fee. Fortunately, we had a version of sorts of the only scene of hers that really mattered, and I told Clive that with clever cutting the rest would not be missed. I asked Fred to confirm this, but he merely stared at me blankly and turned up the volume of his deaf aid. The static echoed round the little studio and was so loud that even Fred's insensitive ears were penetrated. He gave the appliance a great clonk with the bowl of his pipe. There was a flash and a puff of smoke, and then silence. The deaf aid had finally capitulated, and from then on communication with Fred was by sign language alone. We decided to start on the stripping scene, and knowing how very professional Gloria Edgecliffe was, I prepared for it with a good deal of confidence. I asked Fred if he was ready to shoot. After repeating it 3 times and finally writing my question down, he yelled back that there was something wrong with the shutter. Don moved towards me with a sly look, but I stopped him before he could make another cheap crack. "This is a silent movie," I said. "Let's keep it that way." "Action!" The word had the magical effect on Gloria that I had expected. She reproduced exactly the performance she'd given in her Wembley flat. But now, with good lighting and film makeup, she was the knockout I had predicted. Everything went perfectly up to the moment when she removed her panties without using her hands. This dexterous manoeuvre won a round of applause from her admiring audience. "Cut!" I shouted, and Mr. Edgecliffe was on hand with the cardigan. "Well done," I said. Very sincerely I congratulated all concerned, and very quickly I pointed out that time was getting on and I wanted to get on with the big scene. But first I had to get the reaction shots of the inadequate husband out of the way. The obvious success of Gloria's strip scene had had a cheering effect, and I was working confidently and well. Unfortunately, the scene had also affected the inadequate husband. He was now incapable of giving a few simple looks at the bed to indicate inadequacy and sexual fear. He could only leer and roll lascivious eyes. I took him on one side. "There's a plain-clothes officer outside," I said. "He has a woman with him who claims to be the mother of your child. I have asked them to wait while you play this scene, and by the way, your wife is on the phone. She also has agreed to wait." This was a shot in the dark, but it worked. We got 3 shots of the inadequate husband looking very inadequate indeed. "Good old Stanislavski," I said to myself. At last the decks were clear for our raison d'etre. We had a short break for lunch and started on the really blue part of the movie. During the lunch break, scaffolding was put up over the divan and our 2 stars got into position so that Fred had a bird's-eye view. As soon as he'd got the bed in focus, Fred called for more lights. Don switched on another light. There was a puff of smoke and the whole studio was plunged into darkness. Obviously the circuit was overloaded. I groped my way towards the fuse box. There was a lot of shouting and several people struck matches. I heard Fred flicking his lighter. Mr. Edgecliffe's voice rose above the rest. It sounded hysterical. He was shouting at Gloria and Geoffrey. He was shouting very loudly indeed. He was telling them to stop acting and get off the bed. I didn't hear Gloria or Geoffrey offering to comply with his request, but I did hear Mr. Edgecliffe leap onto the bed himself and attempt to separate them. At this moment, Fred's lighter, which he had been flicking all this time, suddenly burst into flames with such suddenness that he let it fall from his hand straight onto the bed and its 3 occupants. The old prop man suddenly sprang first to life and then in the direction of the fire extinguisher. Before anyone could stop him, he'd wrenched it free, slammed the end on the ground, and directed the resulting spray onto the bed. The flames went out straight away, but in spite of the screams and shouts of "Stop it" and "Take it away," the old fool continued to spray foam all over the area. During the screaming and shouting, I struggled to get the lights on again. At last I got the fuse in, and I slammed the box shut and pulled the main switch. For a split second, the studio was brilliantly lit up. In that moment, I saw that foam covered everything from wall to ceiling. Stalactites hung from the scaffolding. It was smeared over the lights. The bed itself looked like a giant meringue pie. Gloria, Geoffrey, and Mr. Edgecliffe were like 3 snowmen, struggling to disentangle themselves and to get the foam out of their ears, eyes, and everywhere else. Then, since Fred had not produced the lights, the circuit was just as overloaded as it had been before. There was another puff of smoke, and we were back to square one and in the dark. There were audible signs of panic. As I rushed back to the fuse box, I heard Clive's voice telling everyone not to panic and to pull themselves together. The Duke of Edinburgh himself, had he been so foolish as to have involved himself in this situation, could not have behaved with greater aplomb. Practical as well as inspiring, Clive turned off several of the big lamps before I pulled the main switch. At last we had enough light to start mopping up. Eventually order was restored, and by making desperate signs and pointing to the hands of my watch, I was able to get Fred back into position on the scaffolding. Gloria and Geoffrey got back on the bed. Something seemed to be missing. Gloria whispered in Geoffrey's ear and then got out of bed and spoke to me. "I think it will be all right if we go into the dressing room for a few minutes and prepare for this scene," she said. "Oh, no, you don't," a voice thundered from just behind me. It was Mr. Edgecliffe. He took his wife's hand and pulled her towards the door. He turned to me. "We shan't be very long, just having a little family conference." Geoffrey lit a cigarette and hummed quietly to himself. Clive and I exchanged worried glances. The others mumbled to each other. There were a few sniggers. We heard some marital clichés being exchanged next door. Clive looked at his watch. He was just about to go and hurry them up when a new sound came from the reception area. It was a troop of children, shouting and clapping. Clive and I looked at each other and simultaneously moved to the door. He pushed it open, and there was Gloria Edgecliffe, starkers, apart from her cardigan, in heated argument with her husband. Standing round them were Clive's wife and 6 children. Clive dealt with the Edgecliffes first. "Get into the studio immediately." His voice had that note of authority which is such an asset to the officer class and a handful of first assistants. The Edgecliffes nearly knocked me over as they rushed to obey. I went back to the studio and was relieved to find that the Edgecliffes had resolved their problems and were able to get down to work. Progress was slow, but we managed to get some good overhead shots of the action on the bed. In half an hour, Clive came back and said he'd parked the car and left the family in a little Italian cafe down the street. He was delighted to hear Geoffrey had risen to the occasion, and we had shot at least 7 minutes of spicy footage. We set about doing covering shots from different angles, but it was hard work explaining what we wanted to Fred. Never mind, I thought to myself, if he's managed to achieve half the quality he did in Forgotten Waterways of Britain, then our Dutch backers will be very pleased indeed with The Eager Bride. Looking at it always, I decided that we could have done a lot worse than Fred. Don stayed late to help Clive and me stack the things ready for return to the hire firm. "May I have a private word?" he asked as soon as we'd all the stuff piled up. "Of course, what is it?" "Well," he said, It's the camera. I've checked it very carefully, and the shutter isn't working properly. It was like a low punch in the stomach. I sat down. When did it go wrong? Don put his hand on my shoulder. It's been wrong all day, I'm afraid. Everything, as they say, went black. So the fact is, I said, tell me if I'm wrong, the fact is that at this very moment my partner Clive is stowing 3 cans of completely unexposed film into his Humber. Afraid so. Is there anything I can do? No, I said. Go. He stood there. Go, I repeated. Just go. He went. I lurched round to the pub on the corner and downed 2 large whiskies, one after the other. Clive arrived looking for me. I'm going to take you and Sally to a celebration dinner, he said, before we hit the road for jolly old Amsterdam. Quite silently I screamed to myself. Then I smiled warmly at Clive. Going to push the boat out, eh? Good idea. We deserve a little celebration. We went to a new place, the Chianciano. Unfortunately, I was not in a fit state to do it justice, fond as I am of good Italian cooking. As I attempted to chat amusingly to Sally and Clive, I tried to guess how and when the Dutch people planned to pay the money. Would it be on delivery of the cans of film, or after they'd seen a screening? Finally, I asked Clive, trying to sound very casual. I think they'll probably cough up when we meet them at the hotel in the morning, he said. By the way, I've booked you a room at the place we're staying, the Van Ryn. You'll be staying the night, won't you? I said I would be, and thanked him. In the hotel, I thought. Then that will be before they have a chance to have the film developed. I tried to picture the circumstances and didn't notice the veal scallopini arrive. The meal finished at last, and we went back to the car park where the kids were running round like savages, except the baby, who they were supposed to be minding. He was asleep on the back seat. It took Sally and Clive some time to quieten them down and fit everyone in. He put me at the back, and I found myself actually sitting on the reels of film. Knowing what I knew made for a very uncomfortable journey. It was like sitting on a bomb. The kids alternated between being completely out of hand and blubbing quietly when Clive thrashed round with a rolled-up newspaper. It was a nightmare journey. When we finally reached the ferry, the kids were distracted by the quayside activities, and I excused myself from Sally and Clive and took a stroll round the deck. I was at my wits' end. I just didn't know what to do. Somehow I had to make sure I got my share of the money before the Dutch people discovered the awful truth. I stared gloomily at the water being churned up by the propellers. An amorous couple walked past with arms entwined. They laughed at some private joke, and I silently wished them a watery grave. I hate people laughing when I'm worried to death. A drunk lurched towards me on his way from the saloon. I suppose he thought I looked down in the mouth, and he offered me a cigarette from a carton of 200. "Customs free," he said. I gave a patronising smile calculated to dismiss him. It worked. "Beg pardon, I'm sure," he said, and zigzagged onwards. Then it hit me. How childishly simple it seemed once I'd got the germ. I went into the saloon and ordered a large cognac, which I sipped while I worked out the details. Clive and Sally came in looking for me. I was feeling confident enough by this time to greet them warmly and buy them a nightcap. I was even up to making a joke about Ovaltine last thing for Sally's benefit. The cognac worked its magic, and we had another couple before Sally and Clive went to their cabin, and I settled down for the night on a bench in the main saloon. I slept well, and in the morning I was one of the first to leave the ship. I had arranged to meet Clive at the hotel for breakfast. I found a phone box just outside the dock area and proceeded with the cunning plan I had conceived the previous night. Having only a small overnight case to carry, I decided to save a few guilders by walking to the hotel. I went up to the room Clive had booked for me and had a bath and a shave. I was down to breakfast by 8:30. I left a message in case the Dutch backers arrived early. I was just finishing a second croissant with unsalted butter and cherry jam when a boy came and told me they were waiting. He led me to the lounge, and they all looked round when I approached. There were 3 of them. Our sponsor Hendrika introduced himself and 2 friends. All 3 were expensively dressed, handmade shirts and shoes. Loaded, I said to myself contentedly. We all shook hands, and I explained that Clive would be joining us shortly as soon as the car was clear of customs. Then I regaled them with a lurid account of the film. I went to town in a way that would have been impossible if I'd not known for certain that they would never be able to compare my description with the real thing. I exaggerated its length, quality, and pornographic voltage. I added to the cast list and described feats of sexual acrobatics which would have required Walt Disney's 600 animators to reproduce on the screen. They drank it in. Why be mean, I thought to myself. After all, this is all the fun they're going to get. So I piled it on. As I talked, I glanced round and was gratified to see the lounge was filling up with detectives. Although Dutch, they were unmistakable and wore the regulation plain clothes of their calling. They came in 2 at a time and sat around holding newspapers at slightly the wrong angle for reading. I looked at my watch and suggested to the Dutchman that Clive was about due and that we might stroll out to meet him. As we rose, all the detectives in the lounge stood up, looked at each other, and then sat down again. I looked at my companions and was pleased to see they were quite unaware of anything unusual. Like Clive, they believed that once past the customs at the docks, we were in the clear. Suddenly, Hendrika gave a guttural cheer. He had seen Clive's Humber approaching. Apparently, he didn't notice that it was being followed by 2 police cars crammed with gendarmes. Clive pulled up at the curb, and the kids made catcalls and rude signs as soon as they saw me. Clive gave them a bashing with his newspaper and leapt out and shook hands with the Dutchman. There was a lot of laughing and joking. Sally stayed in the car. Our little group didn't notice the police forming a circle round us, and I guessed they would remain oblivious until the moment the cans of film were produced. There wasn't long to wait. Clive went to the back of the Humber and opened the rear door. I leaned in and picked up the 3 cans, piled on top of each other like a wedding cake. No sooner had I stood upright than all bedlam broke loose. Police jumped up out of the ground as well as out of the hotel and the vehicles nearby. Each of us was grabbed by at least 2 of them. A white-haired detective who reminded me of Lloyd George made his way towards me as though he knew I was the ringleader. The others moved aside and treated him with deference. Clive went white. The Dutchman went red. I knew this was my big moment. The last thing I wanted was for Hendrika and his friends to find out that the film was unexposed. I had nothing to fear from anyone else. I turned to Lloyd George and gave him my Jean Gabin smile, though I doubt whether he recognized it as such. But what I said did go home. Making sure Clive, Hendrika, and the others couldn't hear, I spoke quietly to Lloyd George. These people know nothing of all this, Inspector. I have taken advantage of their friendship. I am the man you are looking for. Shall we go? With that, I stepped into the police car that had drawn up nearby, still holding the 3 cans of film. Lloyd George was so surprised he just stood there staring. After a moment, he instructed his assistants to take full particulars from the others, and then he joined me in the back seat. The Citroën Big 15 zoomed off along the cobbled streets. Lloyd George offered me a cigarette. I'd scarcely lit it before we arrived at police headquarters. Lloyd George politely relieved me of the cans of film. He weighed them in his hands. "Must have a street value of many thousands," he remarked to an assistant, one of many who came out to meet us. I smiled. "Let's go inside and open them," I said. In we went. Well, I won't go into details of what happened in the police examination room, but once they realized there was no trace of any drugs and that the cans contained nothing but unexposed film, they all got very excited and shouted at each other in their native language. Lloyd George was very red-faced and shouted loudest of all. I quietened them down by staring inscrutably at one after the other. When all was silent, I spoke to them. "The way the Dutch police have handled this matter has proved expensive for me," I said. Those 3 cans of film cost me hundreds of pounds, and now they are completely useless." Lloyd George apologised. I told him that was just not good enough, and that I knew there were resources available to the police to pay for mishaps of this kind. I mentioned that I was dining with the British ambassador that night, and that the friendship of our 2 countries was something I treasured above all else. In the end, they coughed up 200 quid. As I stuffed this into my pocket and got up to leave, Lloyd George took me aside and asked me quietly, "Why did you say you were the man we were looking for, and that the others knew nothing about it? You seemed to be admitting your guilt." "I drew your fire," I said, "because I didn't want my old friend Clive Mallory, a decorated war hero and an adored husband and father, to be frog-marched into a police van in front of his wife and children. Oh, I realize he would have been released later, but seeing their daddy seized like a common criminal, those poor kids might have carried the emotional scars to the end of their lives. I felt I had to spare them that." A tear came to Lloyd George's right eye, and he mumbled something about me being an English gentleman. I shook hands and hurried back to explain things to Clive and Hendrika. They were all shocked to hear that the eager bride was a complete write-off. But my dramatic account of how I managed to expose the film to the light and thus prevent the Dutch police from seeing our porno masterpiece soon had them murmuring their appreciation. All except Clive. He remained mystified. "Why did they ever think we were smuggling drugs in the first place?" he asked, just as I knew he would. Fortunately, I had my explanation ready. "I think you overdid it. With 6 children. Too much of a good thing. Why would anyone want to bring 6 children over here in the winter, unless they had something to hide?" Clive pulled a face and nodded. "Yes," he said, "my fault. I'm sorry I got you involved, Jacko. You must feel pretty resentful after all your work." "Not a bit," I said magnanimously. "Anyway, all is not lost." And with that I turned my attention to Hendrika and his friends. I told them I was broken-hearted at the loss of the masterpiece. I explained that we had been so carried away that we'd overspent on the production, but intended making up the difference out of our own pockets, because we knew that we had made a little classic. Eventually they got the message. Hendrika put his hand in his pocket and pulled out a handful of guilders, American dollars and French francs. He said they would all like to thank me, and begged me to accept this token of their appreciation for the brilliant way I had saved them from serious obscenity charges. Altogether, Clive and I pocketed almost as much as we would have done if they'd paid for the completed picture. We shared it equally, but I decided not to complicate matters by mentioning the compensation I had received from Lloyd George. It would have entailed more tedious explanation. In the end, Clive did very well out of it. He got an order for saucy brass door knockers, which have proved a real winner on the continent, and earned the respect and gratitude of his father-in-law. And so I come to the end of this short series, having barely scratched the surface of my treasure trove of memories. I would like to have told you about my fight with Errol Flynn, my food poisoning in Yarmouth, and my romance in a broom cupboard aboard the QE2. How my debut and farewell performance in modern dance occurred on the same night in Barcelona, and how I survived an attempt on my life by the back legs of a pantomime horse. Alas, all these must wait for some other time.